Hello, HIS17B fall quarter 2023. We are still just getting started, so this is lecture 2. And I know you're getting used to my grading and my class setup, so please contact me if you have questions or if you're just uncertain and want reassurance. I have noticed that different people, including myself, come into a history course with different expectations, depending on their past experiences. When my son was an undergraduate and I started studying here at UC Davis, he informed me that he hated history. But I knew that he was actually extremely well informed on history and would watch videos on what to me was history for fun. I couldn't square that until I figured out that what he didn't like was the type of history taught in his K-12 experience. He had started school in England and loved history, and that stayed with him even as he developed an extreme distaste for what he understood to be history in later years. Now, this is not meant only as a knock on K-12 history in the US, although there is a lot to unpack there, but to point out that not only is history itself unimaginably huge, but history as an academic discipline is not a single unvarying practice. At its simplest, history is change over time, and historians are folks who work on understanding what changes have happened over time and why those changes have happened. I found this concept map, if you're watching the video itself, I think it does an excellent job of making history as a discipline visually clear and simple. So you see it's got its primary and secondary sources, has things that shape history. And if you follow it, it's really rather nice. I am going to pause for a moment here to give you some important advice. In communicating history, especially in history classes, never use the phrase throughout history. History is a study of change over time. So if something has always been true, there's nothing in it for us to study. In lecture 2 here, I am going to talk about history as a discipline and a little about various approaches to studying and thinking about the past that should help you both to put what I present to you in the perspective of the larger field of history and to start thinking about the way that you want to approach and communicate history yourself. There is no single best approach, but it is also not an anything goes process when it comes to practicing history as a field of study or a discipline. To start off with, the discipline of history has changed over time. This means that history has a history of its own. The study of how historical approaches and ideas have changed over time is called historiography, which is an amusing word that you may or may not have a use for in the future. I'm not going to go over ancient historians from any region, and in Western historiography, classical Greece and Rome, as well as Europeans, are overrepresented. What I am going to tell you is that history is inherently political. We choose what to ask about, how to present it, what to believe and not believe, and how to understand what we see. One might say that throughout history has been political, intentionally or not. That is a given. History as an academic discipline, the professionalization of historical studies, and the concentration of historical researchers at universities only dates to the 19th century. That would be the 1800s. This process of professionalization and the increasing role of advanced education in bolstering social status among the upper middle classes is part of a larger trend that we will be looking at in this course. This occurred in what people often think of as the late Victorian era. Although since Victoria was never Queen of the US, we do not, properly speaking, have a Victorian era. Many of us think of 19th century history as the great men and events approach. You are looking at an image of Memorial Hall at Harvard University made in the last decades of the 1800s. Your instructor, that would be me, and at least a couple of your TAs are members of the professional organization, the American Historical Association, or AHA. Congress created the AHA in 1889. You're looking at the founding members of the AHA. You don't need to know who they are, but you might notice that all of them have something in common. And I am not referring to their rather marvelous facial hairstyles. These were all white men of basically similar socioeconomic position and educated at the same institutions with the same perspective on the world. These aren't inherently bad folks, but they were also not particularly receptive to any perspective but their own. And they considered that perspective to be objective, ignoring that their own combination of race, sex, class, education, and social status, in fact, shaped their own outlook as much as these things did for everyone else. For 19th century historians, as for other scientists, truth consisted in the correspondence of knowledge to an objective reality that, for the historian, constituted the past as it had actually occurred. That's what they thought. The self-definition of history as a scientific discipline implied for the work of the historian a sharp division between scientific and literary discourse, between professional historians and amateurs. The historians overlooked the extent to which their research rested on assumptions about the course of history and the structure of society that predetermined the results of their research. And you can see down here that I am quoting a historian. So those of you who choose to do a visual presentation or an infographic, you can give credit to your sources in a way like this. Over the course of the 20th century, one shift in the discipline of history was to a social science approach. So I just briefly said that 19th century, 1800s academic history was very much great men and events. So think founding fathers, Revolutionary War, Civil War, like that. So this shift in the discipline of history was to a social science, more comprehensive approach. This approach was new in the sense that it emphasized social structures and processes of social change. You don't need to remember these examples, but when you come across reference to any of these, you will know where they fit in. I've given you as examples quantitative sociological and economic approaches to history, structuralism, or the analyst school, and Marxist class analysis. While this development represented a shift, it was not entirely revolutionary, as it still assumed continuity and direction to history that privileged supposedly rationalized modern Western Euro-American society. So this has left tendrils in historical thinking for many, many people, this idea that there's a direction, that things are working towards something. Doesn't happen that way. We can't see the future. There is no goal or end point to history. This approach developed in the context of European and American empires and a Western belief in progress as a clear line defined by Euro-American social and technological developments. And then there were a couple of absolutely horrific world wars, which segued immediately into the Cold War of the nuclear era. And it made some people start to rethink things. The post-World War II era also saw the breakdown of colonial empires and a disillusionment with the actions of the supposedly free, capitalist, so-called First World. This came with a couple of major insights on the part of Euro-American historians, which came down to the realization that non-Western people also have histories and are not just stuck in some lower stage of civilization, and that marginalized folks existed in history and had their own histories as well. This is often referred to as social history or history from below. This is when you see universities start to add subjects like women's history or African American history to their curricula, and some even added entire departments that focused on the history of one group. A recent approach to history is somewhat unfortunately called cultural history. This is misleading in that it suggests that it means a history of cultures rather than an adjustment of the viewpoint of the discipline of history. Cultural history overlaps with social history in the sense that both deal with people left out of the great men and battles history. But the cultural historian tries to consider that marginalized groups not only have history, but are human actors who shape the course of history. This is where you are most likely to hear about things like intersectionality, critical theory, and social construction theory. Now, these are not wild and revolutionary approaches, as they are somewhat misunderstood in popular culture, but just ways of describing historical processes as they are observed to create a shorthand for scholars to communicate with one another and ideally with those outside of academia. Do not fret about any of these at the moment. We will get to them when we get to them. And chances are that they won't seem particularly exciting until I name them. This brings us to the question of what kinds of history are there? The answers, multiple, depend on the questions that we're asking and how we go about answering them, as well as whom you ask. In the image on the upper left, you can see some of the things that I've discussed, like cultural history, social history is in here somewhere, there it is, and women's history. But they are sort of all put at the same level rather than, say, considering women's history as part of the social historical approach or the cultural historical approach. There are also branches of history in the chart there of particular topics like history of science and art history that I didn't even bring up. Not because I don't acknowledge them, but because they weren't relevant to the historiography story that I was telling you. In the chart on the lower right, intellectual history is the center of everything rather than just being one branch. And art and environmental histories have disappeared completely. We can also define our type of history by geographic national boundaries, or by periods of time, or by any combination of those. When it comes to interpreting the work of any historian, it's useful to know how they describe themselves, and it will generally involve some sort of combination of all of these divisions that I've been talking about. The issue is not whether some historians are more trustworthy than others, but of understanding what types of questions an historian is likely to ask and how they will go about answering them. We need the work of many types of historians in order to put together some understanding of history. No one approach or specialization can do it all. History, like just about any topic, can be looked at from multiple levels, from the big picture to the smallest details. The terms macro, meaning big, meso, meaning middle, and micro, meaning small, appear in many different contexts. For example, microscopes let us see small things. History and sociology share the usage of these terms, more or less. So macro history might look at American politics at any point as part of global politics. Microhistory might examine the lives of, say, free Black people in Delaware before the American Civil War. These are general levels understood relative to one another. So this chart gives some ballpark ideas of what fits where, but don't take this as some graven in stone system. In case you didn't figure it out from the fish gutting, I use silly analogies to make points in these lectures. Most of us do not have one learning style, so even though I actually do love silly analogies for their own sake, that's not why I keep using them in lectures. So both of these photos, number one, the big one, and number two here, the smaller one, or rather what they are photos of, can give us information about the same thing. I won't tell you what that thing is in a moment. It can give us information on lots of other things, but in this case, the questions are about one thing. We can get information on other subjects from these same sources, and these two sources give us different information on the same subject. So if you only got one picture and it was one of these two, understanding what might link them could be tricky. If you figured out that photo number one is of a museum and photo number two shows paint on canvas, then you would probably get that we are looking at a painting valued enough for some reason that it is displayed in a museum. If you recognize the museum as the Van Gogh Museum, then you would probably surmise that the link between these images is a painting by Van Gogh. Just from there, we would be able to ask useful questions, knowing that they would give us interrelated information, even if we didn't know the exact link or painting yet. The questions that we ask would be different, very different at this stage. For example, we could ask about picture number one, where is the Van Gogh Museum? And about picture number two, what type of black pigment did Van Gogh use in his paints? It would make no sense to ask the questions in reverse. Looking at this, saying what type of black pigment did Van Gogh use? And looking at this, where is Van Gogh Museum? The answers, incidentally, are Amsterdam for number one and probably bone black for number two. Impressionists as a group rarely used black, but Van Gogh did in some of his paintings, and clearly he has here. When he did paint with black, studies have shown that he used bone black. Also, bone black is, or at least was when Van Gogh used it, precisely what it sounds like, ground up charred animal bones. So coming back to this is a bit like having only access to history on the macro level. For example, global and political and economic relationships on the eve of World War I, or the micro level, say the personal account of a Prussian shopkeeper on the eve of World War I, but nothing in between. The more folks studying related history, the more information we have, and the more we can relate pieces of information to one another. And then the more questions we will have, and so on endlessly. The painting is Van Gogh's Sunflowers, and I've put a tiny bit of relevant information that we can learn about this on the slide, depending on what level we're analyzing the painting. 3 points here. The more levels we look at something like history, the more information we have about it. As historians, the questions that we ask should be appropriate to the level we are examining and the sources that we are using. We may want to change the answers to some questions once we have answers to other questions. Understanding history is like studying astronomy. We constantly readjust our explanations as we learn more. Now, this isn't usually a complete overhaul. Everyone has been wrong forever. It's usually a finessing and an understanding more and more. We build on earlier things. This class will view American history from different levels, but remember that I have a limited time with you to share a complex set of interconnected stories. This is where your reading, primary, secondary, and tertiary, if you like, for your textbook, will help you to situate lecture material in frameworks that will be more useful to you. View your readings generally as a resource, not as an overwhelming chore, nor as some objective truth. Think of using the readings for yourself rather than reading them for me. Thematic and chronological approaches to history are exactly what they sound like. A thematic approach centers on a particular idea or theme, and a chronological approach goes in order of time from earliest to latest. This is really a matter of emphasis in any given book, article, or course. It is rare to find only one or the other approach alone. In fact, I would say it's pretty much impossible. If we look at part of my tentative course plan, you'll see that the modules are arranged basically chronologically. So here we have 1870s to 1880s, here 1880s to early 1910s. And if you scroll down through it, you'll see that it goes from earlier time to later. But within each module, I'm tackling not just events, but themes like social or economic inequality, both big picture causes and more local responses by different groups are going to figure in here. This brings us to the last section of this lecture. I've tried to make lecture 2 here short because each part of lecture 1 was long, meaning that together lecture 1 was really long. Everyone who teaches 17B teaches the same overarching story of American history, and we cover the same major events and developments, but we all tell it somewhat differently depending on our own interests and focus. So, for example, I've seen this same class presented by 3 different faculty members here at UC Davis, and I have actually loved it every time. And I've seen the same events from different vantage points. So I won't name the faculty because I don't know if they would be happy with me doing that. But faculty member A focuses on conspiracy theories and social movements. Faculty member B is a specialist in political history, and faculty member C is a specialist in immigration story. So each of them spends a little bit more time and has a little bit more to say that is truly interesting on these different topics or in these different genres. I think that it is only fair to give you an idea of my own position when approaching history. I am an Americanist, but tend to put the U.S. into a global picture rather than focusing on the U.S. as a standalone topic. My research focus is the late 19th to early 20th century, but I have studied and at this point taught the full arc of American history from colonial on. Basically, if someone makes me pin myself down, I take probably a cultural history approach. I specialize in gender and sexuality, but these can't be understood independently of other socially constructed categories like race, class, age, or regional associations. This, combined with my tentative series of modules and topics, will tell you something about the way that I will tell the story of the United States after 1865. As with course structure and grading, this is something that you will want to be comfortable with before you sign on with me for the quarter. If you are looking for history focused on presidents and battles, I'm probably not your person. On the other hand, you probably already know a lot about presidents and battles, so I might offer you a different slant on contextualizing what you know. Only you can decide if my 17B is a class that you want. So I try to give you as much information as possible so that you can make the decision early on. I just heard a story that my son apparently said as a young person. This is the part of year where you still have hope before you're disappointed. So what he meant was at the beginning, we say all these great things that we're going to do. And then somehow it doesn't necessarily quite work out the way we pictured it in our mind. So I'd like to keep you on board with me and know also that I'm flexible. So if you tell me you're really interested in something, I'm willing to adapt what I do a bit. Key points for lecture 2. History as a discipline is a study of change over time, not stasis or staying the same. Never use the phrase throughout history in a history class. It's like telling your calculus professor that there will be numbers involved in some of your work. Basically, it makes us break out in hives. The history of the discipline of history is its own field called historiography. You do not need to know the details of the historiography that I have presented to you, but you should understand the basic shifts that have occurred over the last couple of centuries. There are many ways of dividing up the field of history: by theoretical approach, by geographic region, by temporal focus, by subject like art or mathematics, and so on. These are not mutually exclusive. They all fit together to help us understand the past. Likewise, historians focus on different levels of history, from the big picture to the actions of specific individuals in a localized place of time and everything in between. All of these levels are critical because they allow us to ask and answer different but interrelated questions. I had so much fun with timelines in the last coda. Yes, my bar for personal amusement is fairly low at this point in my life. At any rate, I thought it was fun. So in this coda, I'm going to give you timelines of different types, in quotes, because of everything I just said in lecture 2, different types of history. On the left here is a timeline of Western art movements. I find this presentation really frustrating because the orange line, the continuous orange line, suggests a continuous sequence of dates following the line, whereas the date ranges read left to right, earlier to later, regardless of which way the line is going. They've also done something really weird here with the spacing on the dates for the neoclassical period when compared with the other movements. So this is something to think about when you make your own timeline. You want to make sure that you're not confusing or frustrating your viewer. It takes a little digging to find comparable timelines, art history timelines, for other regions, especially ones written in English for obvious reasons. The art history timeline on the right is for the Philippines. This art history timeline tries to be comprehensive in every way. There are multiple geographic regions, along with both abrupt, these are where you have the little dots, and continuous changes over time. I put the website on the slide partly to give credit to the makers of this, and partly because if you go to the website, you can zoom in and play with the timeline, and you can also buy a paper copy to put on your wall. We're still in the realm of art and Western art at that. I have given you this timeline because I found that many Americans only associate the word modern with the 20th century, the 1900s. But for Europe, the early modern period basically goes from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. So we're talking 1600s-ish. This is political history focused on political parties in the US. Now, this only goes to 1900. We will be looking at shifts that happened in political parties through the 20th century, especially when we get up to Nixon and so on. Although not in this sort of detail, I'm not going to go over all of these smaller parties. You need a specialized course for that. This on the left is a fairly simple timeline of Western economic history, and on the right, a more complex representation of the same thing. So you get more information in here, which you may or may not be interested in. You get an overview here. Here we have the periodization or division of French history here and American history here. You will notice that they are not the same, and I expect that surprises you not at all. So our course is going to take us from Reconstruction through Gilded Age, Progressive Era, World War I, Roaring '20s, Great Depression, World War II, Cold War, and the Civil Rights Movement, although I shift this around a little bit. So you can see what they've done here is take it chronologically but they've also given a theme to each chronological break. And the same is true here if you know French history. This one is education history. You can see that the first PhD or Doctor of Philosophy degree was issued in 1861 from Yale University. The first Moral Land Grant Act of 1862 made way for more universities. And this is and will be interesting to us. We see the second Moral Land Grant over here. And the Moral Land Grants set aside land for colleges that accepted a diverse group of people. So they accepted women and they accepted Black people earlier than private colleges like the Ivy League. UC Davis is a moral land grant university. And I know I say moral like M-O-R-A-L and Morrill, M-O-R-R-I-L-L very similarly. So know that this is the Morrill one. And finally, since fashion history is a legitimate field that offers a doctorate degree of its own, here is a bit of self-indulgence, which is a fashion history timeline. Now, you might notice a couple of things. Somehow only women have fashion except earlier in time. And then there's a very huge jump from the Stone Age to ancient Egypt. And then we focus on this sort of Western historical story.